It's no secret that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a pretty expensive game. There are tons of cards that are way up there in price, but in today's video I wanted to talk about some of the most expensive cards in the game and give you guys my opinion on whether or not you need them. Now when I say need, I'm talking of course about competitive play. If you're playing more casually, just play whatever you think is the most fun. That's one of the best parts about casual play. But if you are playing competitively, and especially if you are playing competitively on a budget, this video is going to be perfect for you because I'm going to talk about some alternatives to these very pricey cards. Now everyone has their own definition of very expensive, but for today's video, just to narrow it down as much as possible, I'm only going to be talking about cards that currently are about $60 or more per copy. Keep in mind that everyone's budget is different, whether or not it's a high budget or a low budget, and today's video is not meant to make fun of anyone for not spending more money on Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I'm simply trying to talk about the current most expensive cards and their alternatives in the format. There are a lot of cards in the format that are currently like $20 to $40, but if I talked about all of those in addition to the very expensive ones, this video would be like an hour long. So maybe if this video does well, we can talk about some of those like $20 to $40 cards, but in today's video, I primarily wanted to focus on those cards that are worth $60 or more a copy. I also wanted to mention that if you stumbled upon this video many weeks or perhaps even months after it was uploaded, some of these card prices might have changed. Perhaps the cards in today's video got reprints since I originally uploaded it. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about the first card, Pot of Prosperity. Now, right now, if you wanted to pick up a Pot of Prosperity, one individual card would cost you over $100, around $130 at the moment. And that obviously is a lot of money. If you wanted to buy a playset of Pot of Prosperity right now, you would have to spend over $400 unless you could find someone that would give you a deal. Overall, Pot of Prosperity is one of the most expensive generic cards in the format right now, but luckily a lot of decks have other alternatives. Pot of Extravagance right now, ever since the Maximum Gold Eldorado reprint, is sitting at about $16 a copy, and many of the decks that you play Pot of Prosperity in, theoretically you could play Pot of Extravagance instead. For example, in my Madolche deck that I've profiled a few times on the channel, I usually try to play Pot of Prosperity, but Pot of Extravagance is just as good in that deck as Pot of Prosperity in many situations. Now, Extravagance can't always replace Prosperity. If you're playing a deck with a bunch of one-of extra deck monsters, you probably don't want to play Extravagance, and in that case, you could consider playing Pot of Desires. Pot of Desires has a bunch of budget-friendly reprints. You can pick this card up for under $1 a copy, and honestly, it's a great card right now. A ton of non-budget players are using Desires in decks like Sword Soul Tenyi, for example, because drawing 2 cards is really good, but they don't want to banish any cards out of their extra deck. Pot of Prosperity is so expensive right now because it's never received a reprint, but I'm sure a reprint is just around the corner. So if you don't own this card right now and you're not really playing in super big tournaments where you absolutely need it, I would say just try to play some of the alternatives until a reprint is announced. Next up, we have Lightning Storm, which does have multiple prints, but the least expensive one is the King's Court Ultra Rare version, which is around $60 to $70. Now, Lightning Storm is a very popular side deck option right now, but I think for back row removal, there are plenty of other budget-friendly cards. You have things like Twin Twisters or Cosmic Cyclone or Red Reboot, all pretty good cards that deal with back row. If you're willing to spend a little bit more, you can buy a playset of Evenly Matched for less than the cost of one ultra rare Lightning Storm. Now, the only problem with that is that sometimes people play Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched, so if you use Evenly Matched to replace Lightning Storm, that doesn't really work. But in that case, you could play 3 Evenly Matched and then 3 other back row removal cards. Now, where replacing Lightning Storm gets a bit trickier right now, at least, is that a lot of people play it for the monster removal as well. And while you could play a card like Regeki or Dark Hole, I wouldn't exactly recommend that because Lightning Storm is so good because it can either be back row removal or monster removal, and if you play just Regeki or Dark Hole, now you don't have back row removal. The format is extremely diverse. There are tons of top decks out there, so having a card in your side deck that's good against monster heavy decks and and back row heavy decks is a really good thing to have. I would say that for this reason, Evenly Matched really does look like a pretty good card to replace Lightning Storm with even more, because once again here it's good against monster decks and back row decks. So overall, I don't think that Lightning Storm is a necessary card for the current format. I think that if you just had a playset of Evenly Matched, that would be about as good as a playset of Lightning Storm. Obviously, both cards are very strong right now, but if you are trying to play on a budget, I think Evenly Matched is a budget alternative. If you can't afford Evenly Matched either, I would suggest just playing other back row removal cards. You have cards like Twin Twisters and Cosmic Cyclone that are pretty inexpensive, but still very good. In that case though, you want to make sure you have other cards in your side deck for those monster heavy matchups. Next up, we have Baron de Fleur, or perhaps Barony de Fleur. I don't know, people pronounce this card all sorts of different ways, but this is the brand new level 10 Synchro monster out of the recently released Legendary Duelist Synchro Storm. Now the bad news is I don't actually think there is a good replacement for this card. There isn't really a generic level 10 Synchro that does what this card does. The good news though is that most decks don't actually play this card. It's pretty much only played in Sword Soul decks, or perhaps a couple rogue decks out there, so it's not nearly as popular as some of the other more generic cards we've talked about in today's video. The other good news though is that you only really need one copy of this card, so while it might seem like a very expensive card, and it certainly is pretty darn expensive, luckily you don't have to worry about buying more than one copy for your deck. Now of course there are other good level 10 Synchro monsters in the game, but Baron is so unique because it's extremely generic to bring out, it doesn't require any specific materials, and it has 3 insanely powerful abilities. But unless you are playing a Sword Soul deck, which already is not budget friendly at all, you probably don't need Baron to play the current format. Pretty much all of the other top decks in the format right now don't play this card. It is almost exclusively a card for Sword Soul at the moment. It is good in rogue decks. I've showed a zombie deck in the past that plays this card, but even in that deck you don't need to play this card. Zombies have functioned for a long time without it, and they'll still be okay even if you don't own it at the moment. Next up, of course, we have to talk about Forbidden Droplets. Right now this is probably the most commonly played expensive card in the entire game. Pretty much every deck is playing this card if the player can get a hold of it. This card does have 3 different prints, but all of them are quite expensive. The least expensive one is around $95 a copy. That is pretty crazy, especially considering compared to a card like Pot of Prosperity, this one actually does have multiple prints. I will say here, very similar to Lightning Storm, that you can find replacements for different aspects of Forbidden Droplet, and you can find them on a budget. However, there aren't really any other replacements in the game right now that are as versatile as this card. You can play Darkler No More for going second, but you can't really main deck that card as well as you can main deck Droplet, because Droplet is a quick play spell, which means even if you draw it when you go first, you can still set it as a form of interruption. You can also play a card like Forbidden Chalice if you do want a quick play spell, but that one isn't going to be as impactful against a big board, and it also targets, which can be a problem in some matchups. So Forbidden Droplet is a card that has alternatives out there, and you don't need it to play the game, but there really isn't another card in the game that can do quite what this card does. And that is a real shame right now because the card is so darn expensive and a lot of players can't afford it. I will say here, be a little bit cautious about Forbidden Droplet right now. I don't know when the next reprint will arrive, but I would imagine that Konami is aware that players are not happy at how expensive this card is, and I wouldn't be surprised to see another reprint in like early 2022. But yeah, you don't need to own this card if you want to play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, but you're not going to find a card that's as good as this card is in so many different situations. Finally, let's talk about access code talkers. So before Maximum Gold Eldorado, this card only had 1 print and it was around $180 at its peak, but after the Maximum Gold Eldorado print, we now have a version that's just under $60 a copy. And for some players, you know, there's not a huge difference between $180 and $60, but for a lot of players out there, I think that was a big enough difference to actually allow them to buy 1 copy of Access Code Talker. Now once again here, because it's an extra deck card, very similar to Baron, you only need 1 copy of this card in most decks. So instead of having to pay $180 for 1 card, you only have to pay $60, which is a pretty big difference for a lot of people. If you can afford Access Code Talker, I think it is a good card to own right now. It is one of the best Link 4 monsters in the entire game, especially in terms terms of how good it is at breaking boards. However, if you can't afford Access Code Talker, it's probably okay. There are other good Link 4s in the game. Borrelsword Dragon, for example, might not be as good at breaking boards as Access Code Talker, but it is very good at OTKing, maybe even better than Access Code Talker in some situations. And that card you can pick up for less than $5 if you buy the maximum gold version from last year. So Access Code Talker is a lot less expensive than it was in the past, but even if you can't afford it now, don't worry that much because Borrelsword Dragon is a pretty good replacement. It's not going to be as good at popping cards because it doesn't have that effect, but it still can OTK the opponent pretty easily, and you can attack over multiple monsters using its ability. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comment section below, what budget alternatives have you been using over the past few months to replace some of the more expensive cards in the format right now. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I'll see you later. Goodbye.